back to the Wisconsin Vegetable Garden Radio Show with your hosts, Joey and Holly Baird.
Holly, let's go to the Ivy Organics 3-in-1 Plant Grower Hotline and head to Wyoming to bring in our next guest.
Jill Winger is a blogger of the Prairie Homestead and author of the Prairie Homestead Cookbook. It's Jill's mission to help modern folks create a richer, slower, more meaningful life through this crazy, beautiful thing we call modern homesteading. She lives on a 67-acre prairie homestead with her husband and 3 children who knows how many farm animals. Welcome to the program, Jill.
Hey guys, I'm thrilled to be here. Thanks for having me.
Well, thank you for taking time out of your day to join us on the program and enlighten us about some items in which many of our listeners, or at least some of them, may not be familiar with.
Yeah, it should be fun.
So let's start with, how did you get into homesteading, and is that how you and your husband grew up? Because we hear stories about all of this. I grew up in the city, but then I became a homesteader. How did your story begin?
So my story was kind of along those lines. Neither my husband nor I grew up in a rural lifestyle. But for both of us, I think me especially, it's like was in my blood from the day I was born. So like literally I was 3 years old asking my parents if we could move to the country. Why didn't we live in the country? Why didn't we have farm animals? Like I've just been really weird on that account like since birth. But yeah, I was raised just a typical kind of 90s child, little house in a little suburb, like nothing country. And so the progression started happening when I turned 18. I decided I wanted a career in the horse industry. I moved 1,200 miles away to Wyoming to pursue that. Long story short, met my husband and got married, and we decided our first house would be this tumble-down farmstead, 40 miles from nowhere, and that's kind of the birth of where this idea of homesteading came from for us.
Okay, great. Now, even if you live in a studio apartment in a high-rise in the middle of a busy city, how can one use that to be a modern homesteader?
Yeah, great question. So for me, homesteading is really beyond just having property or having a certain type of animal or a milk cow or whatever. It's really a mindset of being more self-sufficient and really shifting from being just a consumer to a producer. And so you can do that regardless of where you live, like you said, even in an apartment. So I recommend for folks who can't move or can't get to the country, just start with the food. How can you produce more of your own food? How can you go, if you can't produce it yourself, go straight to the source, work with farmers, go to farmers markets, and then you can take it back to your kitchen and really learn how to prepare it. And that's not only going to reduce the chemicals and the preservatives that you're getting in boxed foods or processed foods, but it's really, really fulfilling and satisfying.
Okay, that's really, a really good point, the consumer to the producer. Now let's talk about your book, the Prairie Homestead Cookbook. Can you tell us more about it, what's in it, anything you want to highlight in there?
Yeah, so the book came out April 2nd, so it's about 2 months old. It's literally like a baby having a baby. It's like a long process. But I created that book. I know there's lots of cookbooks out there. I'm like, does the world really need another cookbook? And I ultimately came to the answer that yes, it does, because I found myself kind of a little bit disinterested in a lot of the farm-to-fork cookbooks that I was reading, just because they had some obscure ingredients and things that were very hard to find. And here in Wyoming, we don't have a super fancy local foods movement. We're still kind of in the infancy of that. So we have basic foods, and I can grow basic foods. And so I really wanted to show people how you can cook from scratch some meals with real foods and none of the exotic ingredients that are hard for a lot of us to find.
Now, I want to go back to the homesteading aspect of your lifestyle. Many people think of a homestead as having to be very large, but you're only on 67 acres, and people have homesteads of a 1/4 acre. What is something of the homestead that you find very fascinating that you didn't realize was part of the part of being a homesteader? Yeah, so just to clarify your question, just what is something you can do in the homesteading realm that maybe would not be obvious? Yeah. I think for me it always has come back to the food. Because if you think about it, even if someone is a commercial producer of food or, vegetables, milk, dairy, meat, whatever, or a home producer, you have to know how to prepare that food.
And that's a huge part. So you can have the most beautiful garden, but if you don't really know what to do with those vegetables that you're growing, it's going to be all for naught. So if you can, learn those old-fashioned kitchen skills, taking whole ingredients and turning them into edible, delicious meals, like that's a huge aspect of homesteading that really doesn't have anything to do with necessarily keeping chickens or milking a cow, but that's a really important piece.
Now, you grow, you're in Zone 5 up there in Wyoming, and it's a very cold climate, and we're here at our flagship station in Zone 5 in Milwaukee. We typically don't have as harsh weather as it seems as you did. You had snow in early May. How do you garden in a very cold climate? What are some go-to tips that you exercise in order to guarantee that you're going to have something before the cold hits again on these warm weather crops?
Yeah, man, sometimes it's harder than others. So we actually had snow like 8 inches 4 days ago. Like, it's still melting. It's just insane. But we still get a pretty good garden in and harvested every single year. So 2 things. The biggest thing, I think, is, it's kind of obvious, but just knowing your first and last frost dates and really paying attention to those. I know a lot of folks who move here, and the weather here usually warms up to the 60s and 70s the first part of May. And it's so deceiving because you want to be outside and you want to be planting. But our last frost date is not till like June 1st. So you got to pay attention because the snow will usually come after that warm up. And so you can do things like greens, plant some kale seeds or put in some really hardy springtime seeds, but that's about it. So pay attention to what your recommended frost dates are, and try not to deviate from that, just so you don't have heartbreak over frozen vegetables. And then the other one, this has kind of been a more recent lesson, is if you can pull on any local gardening resource or locally owned gardening stores for both information or for purchasing your plants, use those resources. Because I realized my first few years here, we don't have a lot of great local gardening stores. We just have a handful. But I would go to the big box stores like Lowe's and Home Depot, and they would have plants that, they said were fine for Zone 5, but they never actually really thrived here. And it wasn't until I started talking to really knowledgeable local gardeners, they're like, you have to pick plants that are really rated for our type of Zone 5 or that are really been researched to thrive in our area. Because what they might have at a big box store is technically Zone 5, but it's not quite as targeted. So once I started really focusing on what are the native species and not trying to get too exotic, because exotic does not thrive when you're this harsh of a climate, that has helped us have more success.
And now, are you growing under low tunnels, greenhouses, high tunnels, or are you just being aptly exposed to the elements with no protection on the plants whatsoever?
Yeah, right now we're just exposed. We talk about doing a greenhouse every year, and I think it's in the cards maybe in the next couple years. Our biggest holding back at this point is we get 60 to 70 mile-an-hour winds, like sustained winds during the winters, and snow loads and blowing snow. So some of those cute little greenhouse kits, like they would be demolished in a week. So we've got to figure out how to make a greenhouse that doesn't cost an arm and a leg, but is going to be able to really withstand the elements because it's brutal out here.
Sounds like a beautiful place in the middle of summer, but that's the winter doesn't sound too fun there.
It's drastically different, from season to season.
We're talking with Jill Winger. She is the author and blogger at the Prairie Homestead. Now, a lot of gardeners, canners, homesteaders can get burnt out mid-season, end of season, or have time management issues. How do you deal with those problems?
That's a great question because that's a very real issue. So I think the biggest piece of that is, comparison. And it is really easy to compare because there's so many amazing homesteaders and such, or farmers or gardeners on social media. But the comparison can often drive you into a place of doing too much or doing things you don't really want to do, but you're just doing because you think you should, because that's what all the good gardeners do, or that's what all the good homesteaders do. So I think the first piece of avoiding burnout is really asking yourself, why am I doing this? Why am I planting this? Why am I growing this crop? Is it because I love it and it makes me feel excited, or is it just because I'm doing it out of obligation for some, unknown standard of what the perfect gardener is? And so that, has helped me to get clear on the things I really want to do and the things I can just cut out. And then the other part of that is just, you can't do it all. And especially as homesteaders, we're trying to live an old-fashioned lifestyle in a very modern world with lots of other things and responsibilities that we have to do. So we can't just, well, most of us can't just be in the garden or on the barnyard all day long. So it's this element of doing what you can and just being okay with saying no or leaving the rest and just finding a place of peace in that.
Let's talk about your book a little bit. What was the inspiration behind the book? Where was the aha moment you said, I'm going to write this book, we're going to do it, and this is the reasons why?
So it's really, I'd say the most inspiration is just, we've been on this homestead for 10 years, so it's literally this, not necessarily a journal, but a dialogue of our life here on the homestead, and it's everything we've learned and everything we've discovered, and lots of personal tips and tricks along the way because we are living it. We're in the middle of it for real. But I really wanted to inspire people and give other people the tools to know they can cook from scratch without it being complicated. Because, even though I love this type of lifestyle and this type of cooking, I don't have 8 hours a day to spend in the kitchen, and I think most people don't either. So it was this idea of, I want to, like you said, the light bulb came on, and I'm like, I need a handbook that can inspire people to ditch the boxes and the processed foods and the canned foods and get back to the basics, and they don't have to feel like it's this burden to cook this way for their families.
And that's the thing. I'm just picking a number. The last 25 years, convenience has surpassed healthiness and family time, and we can put it in the microwave, and we can eat, and we can watch TV while we do it, and that's the way that the life is now. When I grew up, and I'm sure you're probably very similar to this, we actually sat around the dinner table. There was not a TV in front of the dinner table, and whether we wanted to or not, we had to talk.
Yes.
Where can we find your book at? Where is the locations our listeners can go?
And your website.
And your website, yeah.
Yes, so I always recommend if you have local bookstores, go to local bookstores and support them and get the book there. If not, you can find it on Amazon or Barnes & Noble. And then you can follow me on the web. I'm all over social media, and my blog, which is kind of the hub of everything with lots of freebies and good content, is theprairiehomestead.com.
The book is the Prairie Homestead Cookbook. If you want something that will impress your friends and family, you need to pick up this book because there's a lot of great recipes. There's a lot of other things in the book that will help you, even if you're just an urban apartment dweller. There's things in which you can glean off to increase and make your life easier. And we greatly appreciate the time you've taken, Jill, to share and enlighten us, not only Holly and myself, but all of our listeners.
Absolutely. It was a blast. Thanks for having me, guys.
For more information, please visit thewisconsinvegetablegardener.com.